It was one of Europe's largest and most populous countries for a time, covering some 400,000 square miles with a multi-ethnic population of nearly 11 million people. This included Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Prussians, Jews, Livonians, and many other smaller groups like Tatars and Cossacks. Science and literature flourished under a quasi-democratic government, as did a lucrative trade in grain which spurred the country's development and urbanization. A general degree of religious tolerance saw mosques popping up between churches and synagogues. Although the episode title and thumbnail probably gave this away already, I'm talking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a unique dual state that mixed confederacy and federation, oligarchs and small R republicans, all topped off with a bit of good old monarchism in a political system known as Golden Liberty. And it all started with a marriage back in the late 14th century between an underage Hungarian princess and the pagan ruler of Lithuania. Oh, and hey, just a heads up, there's probably going to be names for some people and places that I don't get exactly correct in this episode. As always, when I'm dealing with, different languages, I try my very best to get the pronunciation as accurate as possible, but sometimes I don't land on the mark. So no offense is meant by that, and hope you enjoy the episode. That underage princess I just mentioned was Jadwiga of Poland, who eventually would become the kingdom's first female monarch in 1384. Daughter of Louis the Great, who ruled Hungary, Croatia, and Poland, Jadwiga originally was the favored successor back in Hungary. But after her father died and her sister, with their mother's backing, took on that role, she headed north to Krakow, where, with the support of Lesser Poland's nobility, she was crowned king. Yes, that's right, king. This may have actually been a not-so-subtle jab at Jadwiga's prospective husband, William of Austria, who the Polish nobility opposed becoming king, at least not without further negotiations. Either way, it really didn't matter, because there was another bachelor on scene. Enter the Grand Duke of Lithuania. So what if he was pagan? And never mind Jadwiga's betrothal to William when he was, 14. As far as the nobles were concerned, Lithuania was a regional power, having become the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their marriage just made sense. But Jadwiga loved William, despite him being a little on the hefty side and, inbred. And so, it was only after a long period of prayer and possible divine inspiration that she agreed to marry the Grand Duke, who also agreed to convert to Catholicism and do his best in getting the rest of Lithuania on board with the program too. All this led essentially to a prenuptial agreement known as the Union of Crzewo, which brought Poland and Lithuania into a close two-state alliance. A series of other agreements would, over time, strengthen what became known as the Polish-Lithuanian Union, the precursor to the actual Commonwealth itself. And there was good reason to cooperate. Lithuania, despite having essentially become the dominant military power in Eastern Europe, still had a rather troublesome neighbor to deal with, the Teutonic Order. Having first arrived in the area during the Northern Crusades of the late 12th century, this German military order quickly established itself along the Baltic coast, from where its knights continued to lead raids into pagan lands, and occasionally stumble drunk into Polish-Lithuanian territory, causing havoc and whatnot. It's what you do. The Union proved beneficial here, with the two states' combined forces defeating the Teutonic Order at the Battle of Tannenberg, also known as Grunwald, in 1410. The battle signaled a shift in the balance of power for Eastern and Central Europe. Within just a few decades, the Teutonic Order had completely lost their state, with the western half being annexed by Poland and the remainder becoming a fiefdom of the crown. It also gave access to valuable Baltic seaports, which led to an explosion of trade, particularly in grain products. The city of Danzig, or Gdansk, and the region of Pomerania was of particular importance here, but other cities benefited as well, like Poznań, Lwów, Warsaw, and the capital Krakow. However, when compared to other European countries, the urban population of Poland-Lithuania remained low, never going above 20%. Much of this probably stemmed from the ongoing importance of agriculture well into the Commonwealth period. In fact, nearly 90% of exports were composed of just 3 items: rye, cattle, and furs. Another contrast with the rest of Europe, mostly, was the pseudo-democratic nature of parliament, which had the ability, through a sophisticated bureaucracy, of electing the country's ruler. The tradition of king approval, or disapproval, was by this point already long established in Poland, dating back to the very beginnings of the state and possibly even the somewhat mythical founding of the Piast dynasty in the 9th century, which means it might even predate the Icelandic Althing by a century or even more, if the legends are true. The 16th century was a big one for the two countries. You had the Protestant Reformation, abolition of slavery, advances in science and literature with Copernicus devising a heliocentric model of the solar system, codification of the Polish language, and wars against the Ottoman Empire. And, oh yeah, you also had the Union of Lublin, which officially changed the Polish-Lithuanian Union into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a single political entity. It created a new elected monarchy, common senate, and parliament. The Commonwealth, however, was partly born from necessity. Lithuania was on the losing side of a series of border wars with the Grand Duchy of Moscow, now rebranded as the Tsardom of Russia, which sought to unite all ethnic Ruthenians under its rule. This wasn't unnoticed by the Polish nobility, but they were reluctant to offer help without receiving something in exchange. And that something was land, with the Lithuanian counterparts eventually ceding a large amount of territory for Polish settlement in what is now Belarus and Ukraine. The locals didn't seem to mind welcoming the new economic and political opportunities that came with Polish administration, but that apparently still wasn't enough, and the Poles pushed for full incorporation of the Grand Duchy. The Lithuanians dug in here, only agreeing to a federal state, which guaranteed their continued autonomy. Perhaps realizing this wasn't going to change anytime soon, the union was fast-tracked, and on July 1st, 1569, the Commonwealth was born. The Jagiellonian dynasty of the past few decades, which started with Jadwiga's marriage to the Grand Duke of Lithuania, had been considered a sort of golden age by many. But, as all things do, it came to an end shortly after the establishment of the Commonwealth, with the last king, Sigismund II, dying childless in 1572. However, this opened a new era of elective kings that would see Poland-Lithuania elevated to the status of an Eastern European superpower. Before delving into that, let's answer an important question, though. What was the status of Poland and Lithuania in the Commonwealth? Were they equal partners? Yeah, the short answer is no. Poland was dominant from the very beginning, getting the capital placed in Krakow, later Warsaw, and pursuing a policy of Polonization in the east. This was most obvious in the spread of the Polish language, which along with Latin and Ruthenian received official recognition, unlike Lithuanian. Young nobles often would travel to Polish cities for education or work, leading to a near complete abandonment of Lithuanian traditions and culture. But while the Commonwealth may not have been an equal agreement per se, the Lithuanians were not inconsequential. They had managed to preserve their autonomy, maintaining their status as a separate legal entity with their own standing military. Likewise, Lithuanians made up at least a quarter of the Commonwealth's overall military strength, which proved important for what was to come next. A lot of wars. Almost immediately, Poland-Lithuania found itself embroiled in the Livonian War with Russia, which turned out to be pretty bad, with widespread reports of atrocities and even cannibalism in parts of the countryside. The conflict actually predated the Union of Lublin, but it was Moscow's decision to dissolve the Livonian Confederation and in its place establish a vassal kingdom that spurred the nobles in Krakow to action. Fighting alongside Sweden, Russia was soon defeated, with Poland-Lithuania receiving the whole of Livonia, Courland, and Semigalia, while Sweden took northern Estonia. This was followed by the Polish-Muscovite War, in which Poland-Lithuania involved itself in Russia's then ongoing secession crisis, supporting one of the many false Dimitri's claims to the throne. Russia understandably didn't like this, but what they really didn't like was the Polish occupation of Moscow in 1612. Oh, and they also took Smolensk. While the Russians were able to force the Poles out of Moscow, it would take another 2 wars and 43 years before they were able to recapture Smolensk. During that time, Poland-Lithuania, and most of Europe for that matter, would find itself distracted by a newly emerging threat in the south, the Ottoman Turks. Not entirely unknown to Poland-Lithuania, the Ottomans nonetheless had expanded greatly by the mid-1500s, conquering most of southeastern Europe. Their advance not only threatened the Habsburg domains of Austria, Bohemia, and what little remained of Hungary, but also the whole of Christendom, or at least that's how many saw it. And one of those many was the elected king of the Commonwealth, John III. So when Vienna, again, found itself besieged by Ottoman forces in 1683, he personally led nearly 30,000 Polish troops to provide relief. A sizable Lithuanian force was also dispatched, however, they were delayed and only managed to arrive after the battle was over. Yeah, so we really can't go any further without mentioning it: the Winged Hussars. These unique, heavy Polish cavalry units were the special forces of their day, essentially serving as shock troops, charging the enemy repeatedly until they broke. Armed with a lance, their primary offensive weapon, and several swords or sabers, hussars were also sometimes known to carry war hammers or battle axes. Wheel-lock carbines and pistols were also occasionally employed as well, most notably in the late 17th century. But what defined these units most was their iconic wings. Often made of wood and elaborately decorated with hundreds of feathers, there are many theories about why the hussars actually used these, wings. One holds that while charging, their wings made a loud noise, like rushing wind, that made them appear more intimidating. In that regard, it may have served a similar function to the Japanese samurai's horo, a large cloak that ballooned when riding into battle. They may have also frightened enemies' horses and protected from swords or arrows, while simultaneously deafening the hussars' horses to the chaos of the battlefield. Either way, the Winged Hussars and Poland-Lithuania more than proved their military strength when they dealt a decisive blow to the Ottomans at the Battle of Vienna. In what is considered the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, nearly 18,000 horses overwhelmed the Ottoman forces, their defeat marking a turning point in the nearly 250-year-old struggle between Christian Europe and the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And for its role, the Commonwealth received the title Bulwark of Christendom. But the good times, they were coming to an end. A Cossack rebellion in 1648 resulted in the loss of nearly all Polish-Lithuanian territory that now comprises modern Ukraine. This was followed by the Russo-Polish War, which absolutely devastated Poland-Lithuania's economy, and in turn the war effort. Out of sheer desperation, the Commonwealth was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, resulting in significant territorial gains for Russia. Oh, and while all this was going on, the Swedes just dropped by and picked up Livonia. Yep, that was gone too after the so-called Little Northern War. For good measure, the Ottomans also showed up, snatching up what was left of the Commonwealth's southernmost territories. When it rains, it pours. And staying with the rain metaphors, this period of near-constant war in Poland-Lithuania was known as the Deluge, with the country losing over 25% of its population and its status as a great power. The Swedes, living up to their Viking heritage, plundered the countryside, destroying entire cities, towns, and castles. Warsaw, for example, saw its population drop from about 20,000 to just 2,000 after the Deluge period. They also stole pretty much whatever they could get their hands on, including both Polish and Lithuanian state records, the entirety of the royal library, and countless other items of cultural significance. I mean, they even pried off the door frames in the royal castle, along with stained glass windows, gates, floor tiles, and fireplaces. Whatever they couldn't steal was usually just destroyed. When compounded with a famine that ravaged the countryside and an outbreak of plague, some consider the destruction that occurred in-country during the Deluge to even surpass that of World War II. But for Poland-Lithuania, the problems didn't stop here. The very institutions that had made Poland-Lithuania exceptional by the standards of the day also made it vulnerable. Take, for example, a parliamentary device known as the free veto. It was based on the notion that all Polish nobles were equal, and therefore any measure in the Sejm, lower house, had to be passed unanimously. A single member of parliament could immediately end further debate on a piece of legislation simply by shouting their objection. No! This often resulted in political gridlock, and it probably didn't help that some nobles were bribed by foreign powers to do exactly that. In fact, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and even the French would all sponsor so-called noble factions in pursuit of their own regional ambitions. Poland-Lithuania's elective monarchy also proved susceptible to foreign interference, since nobles in effect chose the king. This was especially true with King Stanislaw II, but we'll get to him in a moment. First, we have another war, and this one's a great war, the Great Northern War. But despite the name, it would see Poland-Lithuania shattered. Russia emerged as a new regional power, while both Sweden and Poland-Lithuania went into terminal decline. Taking advantage of this, Russia began to exert greater control over the Commonwealth, with Catherine the Great eventually getting her former lover elected king in 1764. The fact someone who was literally in bed with the Russian Empress was now ruler of Poland-Lithuania didn't exactly go over very well. To his credit, though, Stanislaw realized the dire straits the country found itself in and pushed for a series of practical reforms. Catherine, however, wasn't very happy about this, having believed Stanislaw would ensure the country remain a puppet state under Russian control, rather than challenging the status quo. Both Russia and Prussia threatened war if the proposed reforms went through, while Polish nobles in Bar, today located in Ukraine, formed their own confederacy opposed to continued foreign interference and Stanislaw, who they claimed was curtailing their powers. To this end, they declared war on Russia and soon clashed with foreign troops stationed in country. Completely ignoring the king, who tried mediating the crisis early on, the self-proclaimed Bar Confederacy sent envoys to other European nations, winning a fair amount of support for their cause. Back in Poland-Lithuania, however, the king had had enough, and soon the Confederates were fighting royalist forces in addition to the Russians. The Civil War allowed Russia to advance its claims of Polish anarchy, which dovetailed nicely into a call for the Commonwealth's neighbors to step in and save the country and its citizens from themselves. In the end, the Bar Confederation was defeated, with most of its supporters either fleeing abroad, being killed, or exiled to Siberia, and Poland-Lithuania was left weaker than ever. What followed really wasn't entirely unexpected. The victors began to carve up the Commonwealth. In what later became known as the First Partition of Poland, the country would lose up to a third of its territory, and roughly an equal share of its population. Russia, in the northeast, would receive the largest share, followed by Austria, who took Galicia, and Prussia, who got eastern Pomerania. To make the partition appear more, legal, the three powers demanded that King Stanislaw, and in particular the parliament, approve their actions. There was, not unexpectedly, pushback. But when the occupying forces occupied the capital, putting a gun to Parliament's head both literally and figuratively, it appeared there was no alternative. Still, nobles like Tadeusz Reten, who threw himself on the floor of the Sejm, protested the willingness of their colleagues to accept foreign territorial demands. To make things run a bit more smoothly during this partitioning, the pesky free veto was suspended, meaning that the partition could now occur by simple majority, and that's exactly what happened in 1772. Despite everything, in the aftermath of the partition, Stanislaw pushed through a series of sweeping reforms. These included expanding voter enfranchisement, establishing 3 separate branches of government, and striving for a constitutional monarchy less at risk to foreign interference. The troublesome free veto was also eliminated, and wide-scale military modernization occurred after an alliance was established with Prussia. This didn't prove so helpful. Following another disastrous war with Russia, the Prussians refused to honor their alliance, and they actually went a step further, partaking in the Second Partition of Poland alongside Russia, which left the country little more than a rump state. In the years afterwards, Poland-Lithuania was forced to downsize its military to just 15,000 soldiers. This angered many, including Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a major general in the army who believed the king and nobility had prematurely given in to foreign demands. A national hero for modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and even the United States, where he, along with other Commonwealth nationals, most notably Kazimierz Pulaski, served in the Continental Army, Kosciuszko led a national rebellion that aimed to liberate Poland-Lithuania from its occupiers. It, however, was brutally crushed, resulting in the third and final partition of Poland in 1795. The Commonwealth, a country born from a union between two countries that at one time dominated Eastern Europe, simply ceased to exist, and what little remained before the Third Partition was carved up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Poland-Lithuania was gone, and it would be over 100 years before either an independent Poland or Lithuania would again appear on the world's maps. Hey, as always, thanks for listening to this episode of Ghost Countries. Poland-Lithuania is just such a big subject encompassing such a long period of time. It's going to have to be a 2-parter, so be on the lookout for that next episode. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace.